Hi, Graham. Welcome to DrDazz Wants to Know Everything. Daryl said, how are you going? It's been a while.
Yeah, morning, Daryl, or rather evening for you.
Oh, yeah, it's morning, man. How am I going? I'm well, thank you. So in case you're wondering, I'm Ferg. He's Daryl. I'll revoice what he says. He is the Dr. Daz. And we've got Graham here, who is also a doctor, but he's just Graham. Hmm? And you're in Dundee.
Dundee in Scotland, yes.
And what are you doing in Dundee?
So I'm in an art college at the University of Dundee called DJ CAD, or Duncan of Jordanstone College of Art and Design. And we have a research group here called Studio Ordinary.
I remember a while ago you were telling me a project about hands and design.
Yeah, I suppose that was our first design project as Studio Ordinary. It was called Hands of X, and the X in the title did not refer to what it tends to refer to these days. This was back in 2016. What it did refer to was what a hand was made of, what materials it was made of, and what that said about what it was in the first place, um, and also by implication who it was made for. So Hands of X had this double meaning. What was it made of, and whose was it? And we were really interested in the connection between those two.
So you're talking about prosthetic hands.
We're talking about prosthetic hands. Yes, that's important to to add. And this, and this was at a time when there was a lot of narrative around superhuman, robotics, cyborg, prosthetic hands, very sort of technically triumphant. Um, or on the other hand, if you'll pardon the inescapable pun, hands that were facsimiles of human hands,
Mm.
and to the extent that they had hairs and veins and wrinkles. And I guess as a design group, working with many people with limb difference, or I should say several really important people with limb difference, we were kind of frustrated that that seemed to be the only choice. And so we were interested to explore something that was just as unapologetic as the robotic hands, but a lot more understated and subtle.
Mm.
And yeah, and no big deal. That was our mantra.
And so in the studio, is it always around disability or?
It tends to be, yes, yeah. I think many different disabilities and many different roles for design, but always somehow a combination of disability and design. We're a collective of disabled and non-disabled researchers, and then we also involve um, disabled people who are more specific to whatever it is we're looking at. Um, and yeah, sometimes we're being quite practical, trying to make things that are useful. But I would say more often, we're trying to change the conversation around disability and around what the role of design might be. Um, and that's, yeah, I confess that can be the most fascinating work of all.
Toronto. Yeah. Sorry, Daryl said, I remember when I met you, it was at an Isaac conference in Toronto.
That's right.
At the research symposium.
That's totally correct. And that's 2016, isn't it? So actually that's interesting. That's pretty much exactly the time we were doing the hands project. And I mean, you were there, you were presenting, and Ferg, you were there too, right? Yeah. So I met you both then. And you were presenting the Bummunicator. And I must say, I recognized immediately the fact that the Bummunicator had a very similar role than our hands project. And we sometimes call that stuff, as designers, we sometimes call that critical design. And I realize that was not a phrase that you used or thought of. But in the same way, you were trying to change the conversation, weren't you, around disability through a piece of design?
For the viewers. So down in the comments or up in the comments, not sure where there'll be a link to the video that Graham was referring to. So originally I was invited to do a keynote in Adelaide, where I live. Is it something to make people think? Yeah. I was doing some gender studies. The idea popped up. For me, it was a piece of comedy. Something to get people to laugh and make a point. But I remember you were quite interested in it as a designer.
Yeah, I think you're underselling it as always, Daryl. I mean, it makes people laugh, but it draws them into a conversation that they wouldn't otherwise have about sexuality. And I know you know that. But...
about my bum.
Yeah.
Oh, we better be careful about YouTube. The ratings. We need to be careful that the algorithm won't disable the video if we talk about bums.
Yeah.
Anyway, but what were you saying?
I mean, I see so much commonality with what we're trying to do and even how we go about it. And I love the ambiguity of the Bummunicator because part of its discomfort is about not quite knowing the extent to which you are joking. And that's always really subversive and very effective, I think, at engaging people. And um, we had, I suppose, the first bit of AAC research I did was in some ways connected. It was a project called the Six Speaking Chairs. And that was something I did with a researcher and designer, Andrew Cook, here in Dundee. And we were interested in having a deeper conversation with people about tone of voice or a lack of tone of voice in voice output communication devices. And the trouble was that if you tried to start a conversation about tone of voice, it would always kind of get sucked into talking about emotions and nothing else. And people would get very, very excited at the time. This was around 2008 or something, that soon you could have biosensors and they could automatically detect your emotion and imbue the speech with whatever emotion you had. And as Englishmen, we were horrified because we spend all our lives feigning emotions we don't have and covering up emotions that we do. And where would that leave us? And in any case, we could see, through the work of other researchers that tone of voice wasn't just about emotions. It was about social interactions and etiquette and conversational intent and all these other things. But they all got drowned out by this emphasis on emotions. And so we did this project called the Six Speaking Chairs, where each of the chairs, we created 6 interactive chairs that let you interact with the tone of voice of speech synthesis in different ways. And each chair took a different model, I suppose you could say, sometimes theoretical, sometimes from a creative practice. And so one of them was about interacting with tone through emotions, but then all the others were about something different. And in that way, we could have a conversation about all the other things that never got talked about. And that seemed really positive.
How? What was different about the other ones?
Well, there was one that was based more on your social relationship with the person you were speaking to, and so you had these little. It was a bit like a flight deck. You had these little flick switches, and you could either be dominant or subservient, or you could be polite or impolite, or formal or friendly. Those kind of things. That came from the work of a researcher called Nick Campbell, who looked at those aspects of speech. And then one was very, very material to make a connection back to the hands, I suppose, where you picked up drumsticks of different materials and you hit a drum in different ways. And so you had this very visceral, intuitive connection between the feel of a percussive act and how the speech would come out. But my favorite of all was the last one, which just had 17 doorbells on a board next to the chair you were sitting on. And we'd scratched above each doorbell a different tone of voice. And to get us going, we'd taken 17 tones of voice from the stage directions of George Bernard Shaw's play Pygmalion, just because they were so rich and beautiful and but then the point was we'd written them in white pencil on a blackboard. And so at the bottom of the board, it said, please customize. And you were invited to sort of rub them off and put the ones that you'd like if you could have 17 tones of voice. And that formed the basis of a really interesting exercise where we we had 50 or 60 people, a lot of them who used AAC, telling us if they could only, or obviously it's a huge increase in the richness that people currently have through text to speech, or they can have as many as 17 tones of voice for the rest of their lives. Which 17 would they choose? And they were very, very diverse. So it's not just that people use their speech in varied ways from sentence to sentence, but overall they have a different range, a different palette of tones of voice, a different, and so that was, but the purpose of the chair, ridiculous though it was, like the Bummunicator, it was to seed that conversation in the first place, because those conversations just weren't happening.
And still not really happening. It tends to be in a rut. Yeah, so it's all about access and vocab and do we have words or whole sentences? So do you think that we are? It seems like we're missing the point. In the AAC field. In general. Would you say that?
I don't know that that we're missing the point. I think it's that some things are always in the shadow of other things. And so coming to voice, I think the thing that so much attention is given to, and it's lovely that it is things like accent and gender of roles and things. And so there are lots of companies worldwide who are proliferating more and more digital voices, and you can choose one that feels a lot closer to who you are, if you're using a text-to-speech device, and that's brilliant. But it's really interesting. It reminds me, I've only this morning made a connection to the prosthetic stuff. When we were doing the Hans Vex project, we went to visit an orthopedic surgeon at a hospital called Stanmore with a limb fitting center in the UK. And we were talking about those human-like hands that can be quite problematic for some people with limb difference, because it looks like they're trying to pass as non-disabled if they wear them, and that in itself can be anathema to them. Anyway, the way that works in terms of prescription is you have a set of swatches of different skin tones, and you pick the one that feels closest to your skin color. And this expert was saying that in itself is ridiculous. And we said, what do you mean? I mean, they're always a slightly unhuman prosthetic pink. I'm sure you know that you can picture the thing I'm thinking about. But he said, no, it's worse than that. He said, look, and he put one hand up and the other hand down and carried on talking to us. And a minute later, he went, look, and one of his hands was a tone darker than the other, just because of the flow of blood and the change of things. And it occurs to me, there's a slightly contrived link to voice here, that your voice is as much about the way it varies in the way you use it as it is in some kind of static accent or delivery. And I think we're completely missing that perspective in AAC. We're getting, obsessed with a particular accent or a particular quality of voice, and the poor relation of that is how we'd like to vary our voice. Talking to different people, expressing different opinions in different social contexts, etc., etc. And it's just, yeah, it's not that there's anything uninteresting. It's fascinating, the accent work, but I think we're not talking about tone of voice and the way our voices change.
It's really important around identity.
Mm.
There's this beautiful video on the internet about this young teenage guy. I use it in lectures. I'll put a link to it down below. He's about 16. He's got cerebral palsy. And he uses an AAC. I think he says, no, he says it's a shit voice. It's American. It uses English, American. He wanted a Geordie voice. So at the end, we find out so there was one. It's important that people know where he's from. Yeah. Oh, the Geordie one. Oh, okay. Yeah. So the other important thing, all of the male Geordie voices pick up the girls. And apparently they're not bad in bed. More bad. Oh, more bad in bed. They're more bad in bed. The idea of the identity, yeah. It's just a beautiful idea. With the Bummunicator. Did you want to talk about that idea? The tone of voice there. Oh, yes, in that video, the Bummunicator video.
Oh yeah, what happens there? So there's a bit of you're setting up the concept by explaining how everyone else you see in the streets gets to show their behind off. And then you want to express how angry you are that you don't get that same opportunity yourself, and somehow your digital voice won't hack it at that point. But what I don't understand what you did next. Did you?
I realized that the voice I was using. It's hard to get angry with. I wanted to express some frustration. I had to build up the tension. I got one of my neighbors to do it.
Ah.
I still had to mess around with the sound. To get the right gain. It is really important.
Yeah, and it's a great workaround, but not terribly practical, is it? You need to book your neighbor in for next Tuesday evening when you thought you were going to get angry about something,
and have a script written.
Yeah.
I mean, fortunately, ChatGPT can probably give you a script pretty quickly now. We go way off piste anyway. I'm going to cut that bit out anyway because I've been rambling on. What's your passion around AAC and design?
That's a really good question, isn't it? I mean, I think AAC does seem a bit bereft of design in all kinds of ways, and I suppose a passion is just to make a contribution because it's such a fascinating field. I mean, I stumbled into it, I confess. I have no neat life story explanation for how I ended up in AAC. And I think as our work has gone on, I've come to realize it's less even than about interaction and more about changing the conversation around AAC and design. And that's come from working with you, Daryl, and Kevin Williams and Lateef McLeod and Meredith Allen and Jamie Priest. And so I guess that fits in with us being a design research group that, yes, it's great to do some detailed design, but also to use design to to look at some of these bigger issues, change the conversation is hopefully another contribution we can make.
Yeah.
It's been a really lovely project that we've been involved in, an international project.
Yeah. You yeah.
That you've carefully got going.
You
Do you want to talk about that project? And the publication?
Yeah.
Imminent now. Hopefully, by the time people see this, it will be real.
Yeah, no, of course. So the project we're working on at the moment, it's part of a bigger project that's called Imagining Technologies for Disability Futures. And it's a medical humanities project, which is worth mentioning actually. So it's not about designing some tech, despite the word technology in the title. It's about looking at that in sort of broader context. It's led by a Professor Stuart Murray of literature and film and disability studies at the University of Leeds in England. And across the project, there are other groups looking at social robotics and what are called haptics and prosthetics. And I think the original intention was that we would look at prosthetics from an art school perspective ourselves, building on the Hands of X project. But I think late in the day before we started the project, I realized that AAC would be an even more fascinating thing to look at through this lens of imagining technologies for disability futures. And so that's what we've done. And I think it's funny, isn't it, that it seems like there's a lack of critical thought around that in AAC. There's lots of excitement and rightly so about new technologies, like, well, it was biosensors at the time that we first met, and now it's AI and things like that, and brain computer interfaces, but less discussion about what we actually want, and also how diverse our wants might be. That's why it's really interesting to be involved with someone like Lateef MacLeod, whose poem "I'm All Right" is a pretty blunt dismissal of the fact that he wants or needs some kind of surgical intervention to, of the sort that is a huge research priority in the brain computer interface field at the moment, that kind of thing. And so, yeah, we got together, didn't we? We had this amazing opportunity to all meet in person in Cancun in Mexico in 2023. And so, yeah.
And even before that.
Yeah. Yeah, we had some online conversations before that, didn't we, in preparation? And then we had this wonderful 2-hour meeting that flew by in a packed meeting room in Mexico, with yourself and Jamie Priest and Kevin Williams and Meredith Allen and Jeff Higginbottom was involved. Katie Brown and Todd Hutchison was joining online, and I think it felt like we were beginning to explore some things that again weren't being talked about. And my favorite of those things, because we had those 3 themes, didn't we? We did talk about technology, because it would have been strange if we hadn't. So we had some conversation around brain computer interfaces and AI. We talked about interaction, and the kind of interactions we wanted, and also the fact that wasn't about some ableist assumption that AAC should turn everyone into one particular kind of communicator. But then the theme that I thought was the most interesting was that of ownership. Not just ownership of devices, but ownership of the technologies that are in the devices. And I think that's a really, in a way, that's perhaps even more important to talk about than ever before, because we're getting excited about the possibilities of AI, but those technologies are evolving on their own agendas, both commercial and in other ways. And so they're things we can harness, but a lot of the talk in that discussion was about how disabling it can be when things that you have come to rely on are stripped away and denied access, or you have to pay a subscription for. And so, yeah, we've got to be not just careful about that, but maybe look for opportunities to subvert that model. How could we harness some of these new possibilities, but really under the control of people who use AAC at sort of, as Kevin was saying, at board level, not just being involved in user groups, but actually calling the shots about what the priorities might be and even what the research agenda might be. So, I mean, it's not that we were able to resolve any of these things in 2 hours, but it was really good to unpack them, wasn't it?
It started the ball rolling. I think the ownership issue is a really interesting idea. There's a hell of a lot to unpack. There's some researchers out there that are looking forward. You're wondering, what should I do? What should I do my PhD about? Something meaty. And out of that, actually got a really good paper, if I can say that. I call it a rat bag paper. We do push some boundaries in it, don't we?
Yeah, and I think more pretentiously we've called it a manifesto, haven't we? Which is I think it's really nice, because we've had some fun leaning into the idea of writing a manifesto and channeling your neighbor's tone of voice. I think there's some nice kind of writing as if we're shouting within it. But I think that's appropriate because it is kind of counterculture and to a certain extent counterintuitive in places. And so I guess we're acknowledging that it's not written as a dry scientific treatise, because that's not what it is. But I think it's given us permission to express, the not just the individual voices of you and Kevin Williams and Lateef McLeod, but to acknowledge that there are perspectives here that aren't necessarily consensual, but are important nonetheless. And so yeah, we've got that coming out in the very august journal, the British Medical Journal, BMJ Medical Humanities. But then we're also going to reprint it. We have permission to reprint it as an artist's book. And drop it from helicopters in enemy territory. I think that's the least we should do.
I love it. What's it called, Graham?
Well, that's a very good question. It's some anagram of the following, or it's about imagining alternative futures for AAC. And the reason we've included the word alternative is that if you paid attention to the mainstream media, you'd think the future of AAC was already sewn up, wouldn't you? That it's going to be about brain to speech implants and biosensors, and it's effectively going to become a branch of prosthetics where everything becomes internalized and personal, and you wouldn't even know someone was using AAC if you spoke to them. And I think that's so against the spirit of that meeting in Mexico, isn't it? That we were really noticing and appreciating the different rhythms of communication that we each had, and also the fact that if the AAC is not part of you, then you can ascribe some of its crappiness to the technology, not to the person. I think there's a very pragmatic aspect to that too. And so, yeah, but I think that people are so fixated on that medical model, I think you could call it, of kind of fixing communication, that we're not thinking about how AAC could actually be a shared resource between two conversational partners, rather than something that was, wholly to do with one or the other. And it's not that in itself is the answer, but it's a very different starting point, isn't it? And I think it'll lead to different thoughts, and that, it feels like some different ways of thinking about things could be useful.
I think that's a nice place to end this.
It feels like
we'll leave it wide open.
Yeah, it feels like a ... to be continued.
Yeah. Maybe there's a new DrDazz wants to know everything in that. Thank you, Graham, for spending the time.
No, it's always a pleasure spending time with both of you. And my goodness, it's coming up for 18 months since we were together in Mexico. So here's to getting together again soon. Come and visit us in Dundee.